Hi guys, it's Kirsty. Today I want to do a video about the fear of going back to square one. So kind of our very worst period of suffering with OCD or anxiety, what we might refer to as our kind of rock bottom, I suppose. But before I go into that, I'd just like to ask, please do subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below in order to stay up to date with the new videos as they're released, so you don't miss anything. So the reason I want to talk about this is because I personally experienced this fear on my recovery journey, but for me it kind of cropped up after I'd started to address the big fear that I was latched onto, which at the time was ROCD. I started to have these thoughts about doing recovery right and relapsing. And then when I did have a bit of a relapse in recovery, because as we know, recovery isn't linear, it felt like the worst thing in the world for me at the time, because I'd had a taste of feeling a little bit better, and then I'd sort of had a bit of a spike again, and I felt quite bad at the time. And OCD can make you feel like the awfulizing that we do in our minds of the thing that we're afraid of makes things seem so much more horrific than they actually are. So my experience was that when I did have a spike after a period where I was doing quite well, I was so upset about it, and I thought it was so bad and that I was going back to square one, that it felt a lot worse to me in the moment than it actually was. Because when I actually looked at it properly afterwards and examined it, I was nowhere near as bad as I was when I was at my square one period, because I was still sleeping okay, I was still going to work, which I could not do in my square one rock bottom period. I was still eating, I was still functioning, which I wasn't in that square one period. But it was the fear of that square one period that made my slight relapse / spike seem so much worse. And it's, as we've talked about in quite a few videos, the fear of fear, so the fear of OCD itself, the fear of the suffering, can be a thing that kind of drives the obsessions. So it's you're so afraid of the experience of the obsessions that's what's kind of driving them, rather than the kind of the subject of the obsessions themselves. And it's the fear of square one which makes your relapses seem, or your kind of spikes seem, so much worse, because you're so afraid of going back to that period that you think it's so awful in your mind that it makes you feel like you're there, even though you're actually not, because you can't unlearn the things that you've learned about OCD. And quite often, you'll find that the reason why that square one rock bottom period is so bad is because you don't know that much about OCD at the time. You don't have the education about anxiety and OCD at the time, so it all seems so much more sinister and scary and confusing and lonely. You don't have the community, you don't know, maybe you even have OCD, so you therefore don't follow YouTube channels like this, for example. So you don't have the knowledge at that period that you have now, which is why it feels really bad at the time. But you can't unlearn all of the things that you've learned since then. You might doubt them. In fact, scratch that, you will doubt them because you have OCD, and you might doubt them if you're an anxiety sufferer who doesn't have OCD as well. But you can't unlearn them. So therefore, the principle of going right back to that period is completely irrational, because your perspective, whether you know it or not, is different now. So that is irrational. But what we need to do is to take the fear out of going back to square one, or as we might call it, our rock bottom period. And in order to do that, a perspective change on it is needed. So I want to share some ideas that might help with that perspective change, that helped me in order to reduce my fear of going back to that square one period. Now, I can just keep repeating the fact that you can't go back to square one because you can't unlearn the things that you've learned since. But that would be reassurance, and it would be pointless because it wouldn't take away the fear, because we will probably doubt that's the case, and OCD might start, you know, we might start coming up with reasons. But what if, but then there's, you know, so there's no point in doing that. So what we need to do is to, as I said, take the fear out of going back to square one. So, you know, we look at going back to square one, that's the worst case scenario. So the thing, you know, the thing that will be driving our fears about going back to square one are the beliefs that we hold about it. So these beliefs might be, it would be awful if I go back to square one, or I just couldn't bear it if I had to go through all of that again. And it's not a surprise that we might hold those beliefs about it, because for, you know, it's quite traumatizing going through those periods when you have no idea that it's OCD. You know, you don't, maybe you didn't even know, if you're anything like me, you didn't know that OCD could make you have these kind of thoughts. You maybe didn't know anything about OCD if you're anything like me at the time. So, you know, you're a bit traumatized from that period, I suppose, in some ways. So you're naturally going to think it's, you know, it was awful. You know, maybe you, if you were like me, maybe you couldn't sleep. Maybe you did feel like you wanted to crawl out of your own skin when you first went on medication, or that you did completely lose your appetite, or you did lose your sense of humour for a period of time because you felt so down because of what you were experiencing. And at the time, maybe you were afraid you'd lose everything because you were unable to function. So it's not a surprise, firstly, that you might hold the beliefs that you couldn't stand it or that it's awful. So don't beat yourself up about that. That's the last thing we want to be doing. We always want to be approaching recovery with a good dose of self-compassion. But it's not helpful to hold on to those beliefs. So firstly, it's good to examine what truly is awful. So take the word awful, you know, we want to have awful as the worst possible thing ever, which would maybe be eternal suffering and torture for, you know, ever. And then, you know, you sort of look at what's a little bit worse than that. Maybe that's, you know, dying a slow, painful death. And a little bit worse than that, having a very long-term, extremely physically painful condition. You know, so you start to go on a scale of what could be. And then you look at, you know, having severe OCD and not knowing that it's OCD. And you could start thinking, okay, but what could I still do in that period? Did you still have a roof over your head? Were you still, you know, able to have a shower? Were you still able to speak to loved ones? So you can start disputing that, you know, although I was struggling at the time and it was incredibly painful, it was, you know, turmoil, you still did have the basic human requirements to survive. So there's that. But you can, you know, you can say, you know, of course I could stand it because I had these things, and technically it wasn't awful. But you need to then work maybe a bit harder to truly believe that it's not awful, and, you know, you can stand it. And firstly, of course you can stand it because you already did. You have evidence that you can stand being at square one because you've made it to this point. So factually, you already disprove the, you know, you already prove the complete irrationality of the phrase, I can't stand it, I couldn't stand it, because you did stand it and you're here. So of course you can stand it again, even if it's white knuckling it, of course you can stand it. But then it helps to go a bit further to truly, because you have to work hard to change your beliefs about these things. It was a really hard period. So you really, and you know, this is ingrained in your mind. So you need to work hard. You need to give your mind real reasons to believe that it wasn't as awful as you kind of felt like it was at the time. So I've explained why, you know, it might have felt more awful at the time because you didn't have the education that you have now, etc. So you have that. you know, technically you had all the things that you need to survive as a human being, says that you could stand it because you did stand it. But then in terms of like looking at, you know, really believing that it's not awful, you need to look at that, you know, what benefits could you gain from changing that belief, like to really believing it's not as awful as you think it was. So, you know, the benefits could be reducing your anxiety, being less focused on having to do recovery perfectly, less overthinking of how to do your exposures, less overthinking of how to get your disputing of irrational beliefs perfectly, being more present with your partner, with your children, with your friends, being less focused on OCD and more able to focus on changing your career. So really look at how it can benefit you to change your belief, you know, and holding on to that belief is keeping you stuck on OCD. You know, how are you suffering as a result of believing that square one truly is awful? You know, are you, you know, is it making you feel tight in the chest? Is it making you feel irritable because of your anxiety? So look at that as well. And then you can look at also, to really believe that it isn't awful, what have you gained as a result of that square one? And this to me was a real game changer in my perspective about OCD, you know, overall, but also that square one period. This is going to sound crazy, but I would not want to live through it again, but I am grateful for it because I was struggling prior to that period, but I wasn't struggling enough that I felt desperate. And it was that square one period that made me feel desperate enough to start making the changes that I needed to make in my life and in my beliefs. So it was because of the struggling that I went through in my, you know, rock bottom period, which I'm referring to as square one, even though technically it wasn't, because I had OCD before that, but it just wasn't severe enough to make me unhappy enough or to threaten me enough, I suppose, to really do something about it. So I can't help but sort of, after I started to look at it properly, feel grateful for that very rock bottom period, as hard as it was, because that was the thing that led me to start learning about what the hell was going on so that I could start helping myself. So looking, you know, start to, why am I, you know, okay, start to, I know obviously Googling is, you know, can become compulsive, but initially you start to do some research into, I can't go on like this, you know, I want to stop going on like this. So start looking into what you know, what's wrong, what might be wrong and what you might need to do. And it was my rock bottom square one period that led me to start looking into, okay, maybe I do need to look at, maybe I do need to consider medication, and maybe I do need to consider doing more than just reading self-help books about anxiety and being more confident in myself and being more assertive. Maybe it's more than that I need to address. So it led me to start taking my mental health more seriously and learn about OCD. And then I learned about all these other things that were affecting me prior to that square one period, that rock bottom period, that I was suffering from. And I wasn't happy because I was just constantly worrying, and I was constantly like, there would always be something that I would have to fixate on. Even if it wasn't a 24/7 thing, it was, you know, it was occupying a lot of my headspace, and I didn't even realise. And I didn't realise that not everyone ruminated the way that I did all the time. So it was my call for change in my perspectives on myself and life. And it, you know, so that was, it was, although it was a difficult period, it led me to find social media groups about OCD, and it led me to seek treatment for OCD. And it led me to learn about mindfulness, and it led me to start learning about self-care, which somehow had evaded me prior to that. It was the thing, because it was bad, it was the thing that led to me, that started my recovery journey. because I had OCD before that, but I wasn't doing anything about it, and I was just spiraling more and more until it got to the point where I knew I needed to make a change because I was suffering so much. But without that suffering, I might not have made that change. So that perspective change and that gratitude for that period, it was almost like my mind and my body said, no, no more, no more. You've got to do, we're not going on like this. It was like they just said no, and I needed to take charge of the situation. And it's been incredibly hard, and it's been one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge of my life, to work towards recovery. But I'm so glad that I have gone, that I did that, because I'm glad that I no longer am the way I was before that rock bottom period, because I know that it's I know it's OCD now, even though I might doubt it from time to time. I've learned tools not only to, help me in my periods where I might spike, but also I've learned tools that help me in the rest of my life that I didn't even know that OCD was interfering with, like my professional life and my life in exercising, and yes, in my love life, in my relationships, I'm aware now of the way it can interfere, whereas I wasn't before. And so I would still be suffering at the hands of it without even realising. So when you start to change your perspective on that sort of big period of suffering that's led you to start working on recovery, even if it's taking a really long time, and even if it is hard, and even if you're having lots of dips, you're on this journey now, which you weren't before. And this is something that, it can really help you to, if you can feel anything good about a situation or any kind of gratitude, then you know that it's not awful. It was difficult, there was great suffering, but this can really help you to sort of see and truly believe that you could stand it, and that, and it's not an awful thing in your life as much as you feel like it is. Doesn't mean it's not hard, really, really hard, and lots of suffering. But changing your perspective like this can really bring down the negative emotions about it and the fear of it. Doesn't mean you want to go back to that period, and you want to be working on your recovery and working on moving forward. But it can help you to get through those periods where you are having spikes. It can help to bring down the fear of going back to square one. If you can start seeing the spikes as being opportunities to, as Rob sometimes describes it as, viewing your spikes and changes in OCD themes and the different challenges it might throw out as new levels in a video game. It's kind of an opportunity to learn new tricks and new ways of, well, not tricks, but, to sharpen up on the tools you've already learned, and, to get out of that spike again, whether that's, working a bit harder on your disputing, or identifying if you've gone back into compulsions, or are you interacting with the thoughts a bit more. So it can really help. Perspective change on fear, on OCD itself, is a big game changer. And, removing the fear from it and removing the, feeling so low about it can really help you to focus on what you need to do to move forward. So I hope this video has been helpful in terms of, looking at the fear of going back to that very worst period, and how you can start to address that and bring down that fear so you're less stuck on it, but also how that can help you to, you might find that bringing down your fear of going backwards and the square one period can also help for that to stop fueling some of the obsessions as well. So I hope it's been helpful, and do take care. Bye.